In the last segment, we noted that Hobbes would object to civil disobedience. That is, he would say that all civil disobedience is unjust. We also noted that Howard Zinn and Martin Luther King Jr. disagree. In this segment, we'll look at arguments against civil disobedience. That is, arguments that civil disobedience is in fact unjust, something one ought not do. Not all of these arguments come directly from Hobbes, but some have a very Hobbesian flavor. So here's one that definitely has a very Hobbesian flavor. Here's a quote that captures the idea, and then we'll set out the argument. "We always obeyed the law. Isn't that what you Americans do? Even if you don't agree with the law personally, you still obey it. Otherwise, life would be chaos." And this is a quote from a Nazi defending her behavior during World War II. She's saying, look, I just obeyed the law. Now, you could think of the argument like this. Premise 1, civil disobedience will lead to chaos. Premise 2, if civil disobedience will lead to chaos, then you shouldn't do it. Conclusion, you shouldn't engage in civil disobedience. Now, you should notice that this argument has a very Hobbesian flavor. Remember, Hobbes thinks that attacking the leader is unjust. It's not just unjust, but also very impractical, because it risks sending you back into the war of all against all. He held the same thing about widespread lawbreaking. He thought that breaking the law was a bad idea just on narrow self-interested grounds, even if you're unlikely to get caught, because if you break the law, you're likely to erode trust in the law. And if you erode trust in the law, you're likely to upend the social order, to destroy society, to revert back to war of all against all, which is the greatest danger to you, which you are therefore compelled by reason to try and escape. Reason, specifically the law of nature, which dictates that you don't endanger yourself. So, Hobbes would say, because violating the law risks sending you to the war of all against all, it risks widespread chaos, you shouldn't do it. So this is a very Hobbesian argument. So what does Zinn say about this argument? Well, he says, look, as a matter of fact, we know it's wrong. Why? Because the civil rights movement in the South certainly did lead to some violence in the streets, and certainly did lead to upending the social order in the South, but it certainly did not lead to a general chaos. It didn't lead to total social collapse. And in fact, the social order in the South, he says, was replaced by a more just alternative. So the idea goes, premise 1, according to which civil disobedience will lead to chaos, is false if you mean widespread, fully general chaos that will undermine society. So if premise 1 is true, it can't mean widespread, fully general chaos that will undermine society. But premise 2 is only true if premise 1 means civil disobedience will lead to widespread, fully general chaos that will undermine society. Because if civil disobedience will lead to chaos just means some violence and some disorder, then there's no reason to believe you shouldn't do it. Because as Zinn points out happened with the civil rights movement, a more just civil order can emerge from the relatively minor violence, that is relative to a fully general war of all against all. So the basic idea here is that the violence you get from civil disobedience and the change in social order that you get from civil disobedience can lead to a better society. Next up is what we might call the anything goes argument. And here's the argument, or here's the idea. If I approve of your civil disobedience, am I not honor-bound to approve anyone's civil disobedience? If I approve of Martin Luther King's violations of the law, must I not also approve of the Ku Klux Klan's illegal activities? And this is a quote from Howard Zinn, and he's not endorsing this argument. He's just saying this is an argument that people make. So the basic idea here is that the law is common. It's something we all share. It's the same for you, it's the same for me. Since it's something we all share, it can guide all of us. But if we start picking and choosing which laws we follow, then I may choose to follow some and disobey others. You may choose to follow the ones that I disobey and to disobey the ones that I follow. For example, Martin Luther King thought that laws preventing people from voting, in effect, de facto segregation. For example, Martin Luther King Jr. thought that laws requiring black people in the South to sit in the back of the bus and to stand if there were no seats available there, even if there were empty seats in the front of the bus, were unjust. He For example, a law that Martin Luther King finds to be unjust, such as laws requiring that black people sit in the back of the bus, or that black people stand if there's no seats in that. For example, Martin Luther King Jr. thought that laws requiring people to For example, a law that Martin Luther King Jr. finds to be unjust, such as laws enforcing segregation, might be thought just by a member of the Ku Klux Klan. And a law that a member of the Ku Klux Klan takes to be unjust, such as laws enforcing desegregation in the post-Brown versus the Board age, Martin Luther King might take to be unjust. Well, the idea goes, if I say civil disobedience is permissible, then I shouldn't just defend King's right to engage in civil disobedience to pursue his ends of desegregation. I should also approve the Ku Klux Klan's rights to engage in civil disobedience to pursue their ends of segregation. So here's the argument. If you approve of any instance of civil disobedience, then you should approve of every instance of civil disobedience. You shouldn't do that. After all, some instances of civil disobedience are bad. And here we can just imagine a very exaggerated example to support this second premise. So suppose the way that I engage in civil disobedience is I bomb a stadium with tens of thousands of people in it, killing them all. By premise 2, you'd have to approve of my action, but of course you shouldn't. Therefore, one shouldn't approve of any instance of civil disobedience. So this is the argument. Here's Zinn's reply. This argument comes from a mistaken idea about civil disobedience. The violation of the law for the purpose of committing injustice, like when the governor of Alabama prevents black students from entering public school, or Colonel Oliver North buys arms for terrorists in Central America, says Zinn, is not defensible. Whether it was legal to engage in support segregation as it was until 1954, or illegal as it was after 1954, it was still wrong. The test of justification for an act is not its legality, but its morality. So here he's drawing a sharp distinction between the law and justice, between the law and morality, a distinction Hobbes certainly would reject. The principle, says Zinn, that I am suggesting for civil disobedience is not that we must tolerate all civil disobedience, but rather that we should refuse absolute obedience to the law. That is, we should support civil disobedience when it's just and not support it when it's unjust. The ultimate test, he says, is not law, but justice. Okay. Let's look at one more argument and then save the others for the next segment. So here's what we might call the debt argument. This is an argument from Plato. Since the state and laws are a necessary condition for everything good in your life, you owe them a great debt. So the idea is, you can think of this again as having a very Hobbesian flavor. Without the state, without laws, we would be in a war of all against all. I mean, Plato doesn't say that, but I'm now sort of using Plato's argument on behalf of Hobbes. We would be in a war of all against all. Therefore, the state and laws are a necessary condition for everything good in your life. Without them, your life would be terrible. And therefore, you owe a great debt to the state and the law. Well, if you owe the state and laws a great debt, then you shouldn't disobey. That would be a poor way to repay your debt. Therefore, you shouldn't disobey the state and laws. Well, of course, civil disobedience is disobeying the state and laws, so it follows that you shouldn't engage in civil disobedience. Here's Zinn's reply. He says, Plato supports the first claim by claiming that the state and laws are what make your existence possible, by making the marriage of your parents possible. And Zinn counters effectively, I think, that people can reproduce without permission from the state and law. In fact, it's well known that they did prior to the existence of the state or law. Well, Plato's a pretty good philosopher, so I suspect that Zinn is mischaracterizing his argument here a little bit. I think Plato's idea is that you couldn't have the very existence you do, this good, comfortable existence, relatively free of violence, relatively free of scarcity, unless you were living in a state, living in under the law established by a government. Therefore, the idea goes, you owe the state a great debt. Well, Zinn is fine with that because he suggests that it's people who are the relevant preconditions for what's good in your life, not the state and laws. And remember also, he rejects arguments that we would be in a war of all against all if not for the state, because he doesn't think human beings are built the way that Hobbes thinks that they're built. So there's no reason to believe, thinks Zinn, that the state and laws are a necessary condition for what's good in your life. In fact, much of what's good in your life you could have independent of the state and law. Okay, so we're going to stop this segment there, and next time we'll look at some arguments that are less relevant to Hobbes, but still arguments against civil disobedience.